Grandy. Yep. Thank you.
Grandy.
Okay. Here we go. All right. So before I jump right in, there's a few things I want to note about this talk. First off, the primary audience would really be a statistical group working in pharma, who's currently working in, say, some alternative software, and would like to move to R as their primary software for analysis. As this is R in pharma, I'm assuming everyone listening is working in pharma to some degree, and the work being done is regulated or for some kind of submission. And reproducibility and consistency of the underlying software that is being used is important. This is a very short talk on a subject that I could probably talk about all day. So I'm just going to touch some highlights. So think of this as some suggested stops on the road to R. Okay, so first off, while you're in the process of moving to R, don't try to hit a moving target. So by that, I mean, pick a version of R and set versions of any packages you want to use and keep with those until some point in the future when you have a stable production environment. Okay. So related to that, number two, you'll want to find some way to establish an internal repository for packages. So there are options like Minicran and Posits Package Manager, but you'll definitely need something. Packages especially can update with some regularity, and relying on CRAN solely to install from could mean that members of the same team may end up with different versions of the same package, which is not ideal, particularly from a validation or a reproducibility perspective. Okay. On to number three, think about how your systems are set up. Do you work mostly on PCs? Do you have a server or both? This becomes a critical issue if you incorporate PCs because you'll want to figure out how to make sure that the R environment is consistent from one PC to the next. This is a little more complex than just making sure you have an internal repository to install from because it's so easy to update packages directly from CRAN and suddenly one PC is different than the next and your underlying software is inconsistent. Okay. So number four, I think, is a foundational step for steps further on this list. Before you can do things like select packages or think about your validation needs, you'll want to understand what your user needs actually are and document them clearly. The possibilities of what you could do with R are huge, but in reality, none of us needs everything there is, and one group's needs will be different from another's, even in the same company. So when we did this, we approached it primarily from the perspective of what statistical needs did we have, and then also what output we needed to create, like do we need PDF, HTML, or Word, or some, and also what format does our data come in. To make this list as thorough as possible, one thing you could do is survey your current users and also review code that you have. So that brings us to number five, find the packages that meet those user needs. Of course, you're going to want to start with the packages that everyone uses. And here we basically mean all things tidyverse. But after that, I would suggest finding the minimum set of packages that covers your user needs. And here we really want to think minimum set because every package you ultimately adopt will carry some risk. I would say most of that risk is future risk. Like what happens if the developer decides not to support that package anymore and it fades away? Or what if the developer fundamentally changes the code so your code no longer works the same way? So we also have to consider philosophically what happens if you find a function in a package that meets your user need, but everything else in that package you don't need. Do you adopt a whole package for just that one function? Likewise, what happens if you can't find a package that adequately covers one of your user needs? But I'll circle back to that last point in a slide. Okay, so related to packages, but so important that I think it should have its own stop on the way to R, is how will you compare data frames? So personally, I've worked in pharma for more than 30 years, and I would say I've never had a time in my career where I didn't need to compare data sets as part of my everyday work. And so, and the compares come into play in things like everyday programming. I have a primary programmer and a verifier. I want to see if the results are the same or find differences. My data's been updated and I want to see what's changed. And also, very frequently in validation. This is such a fundamental need that I think finding the right package for this early on and probably validating it first is really worth doing. There are many good packages that cover this, and there's one that I particularly like called Arsenal, but there's definitely others. Okay. Number 7, learn to build packages. So ultimately, this is a skill that every group using R will need to have. So figuring it out early is really a good idea. So those of us who are used to like autocall libraries and macros will find that packages are a much more efficient way to control the versioning of code and even documents. So by building your own packages, your need to adopt packages for just that one little function disappears. And if you can't find exactly what you want, you can build it yourself. So packages even can be used to house things like standard practice data sets and common documents you might use. Okay, on to number 8, building scripts. So, well, this may not necessarily be a critical component depending on how you're set up. We found these to be so useful that I wanted to share this strategy. So, using that list of user needs that we talked about a few slides back, write an extensive set of programs that address each of those needs, consistent with your common use. So, include all the ways that you analyze data from the user needs, but also incorporate your usual data wrangling. So if you approach this correctly, it is one of those things that can be utilized in multiple ways. First, if your scripts add, say, a compare back to some expected results, like maybe your current results, then this can be foundational to your validation efforts. Second, this set of scripts becomes a library of ready examples for code for users to write their own similar code. And so, and finally, in the future, when you're considering updating to a newer version of R or a newer set of packages, running these scripts can let you know of possible issues you will encounter. Um, Based on our experience, you will encounter issues. So creating those scripts, how you would commonly use R for analysis or output, and setting them up to run in, say, batch R rather than interactively, will give you a great foundational set of code that you can use for multiple purposes. All right, and all of this takes resources. And let's face it, most projects like this are not resourced as well as we would like. So that gets us to number 9, letting people help. This is a big task. Ask for help and accept whatever people can contribute, even if it's only helping with a small part. You'll find that people want to be involved and may have creative contributions to the final product, even if they can't dedicate a lot of time. Okay. And finally, step number 10 is where I'm going to end for today. So this is a bit about validation, but also about what you will generate in R versus whatever you're using right now. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on validation because there's a lot of great talks out there on validation, and I also, based on what I've seen, validation strategy it really varies from one company to another. So I didn't really want to spend a lot of time on that per se, and I don't have a lot of time. But I did include in the slides a link to a talk I found from a previous R in Pharma that I really thought was fabulous on this topic. So I wanted to make sure to share that. But I do want to conclude with a few thoughts on comparing R to other software results. So you will likely encounter differences. Um, these differences don't mean that R is right, but it doesn't mean that R is wrong. And you'll want to spend some time researching the why. Um, I think that your customers, whoever they may be, a lot of times they're internal. They're not going to be too thrilled when you change software and suddenly the numbers are a little different than they were. So you're definitely going to want to understand why that happens. So some whys can include things like differences in default options, differences in optimizers, floating point issues, and convergence criteria differences. And sometimes there are issues with the packages that you picked where they may not be doing exactly what you think they're doing. So just be sure to allow some quality time to figure it out. Okay, so that wraps up my very fast presentation. And thank you for letting me present this very quick talk at RN Pharma this year. I hope I made the time.
Thank you so much, Rose. Um, we we don't have any questions running out, but I do want to just highlight that on your validation statement, Phil's got a poll in the chat, and it's a very interesting poll. I think people who are in this space probably should take it. Do you plan to validate your own do your own validation on our CRAN packages? And it's a very interesting response. If you submit your own response, you can see those details. So
Yep.
in the light of what you said, thanks again, Rose. We appreciate it so much.